It's LaShawn, and I borrowed a story of his from a book of his called How to Meditate. It's a story about an old monk who he had spent his life in the monastery, and for years and years he had kind of struggled with his faith, and he had always prayed for a vision from God to help him strengthen his faith. You might not think that even religious and people in monasteries struggle with their faith, but sometimes they do. He had almost kind of given up hope because that particular prayer of his had never been answered. He had never received a vision. And then one day he was kneeling in his cell, praying to God, and lo and behold, there it was, a vision from God. And he was overjoyed. He was bursting with happiness, with thanksgiving. And then all of a sudden, right in the middle of the vision, the monastery bell started to ring. And that was a signal to everybody in the monastery that whoever's duty it was that day, now is the time to come bring the extra food out to the people at the monastery gate who were in need, the poor people from the area who would come to receive that food so they'd have something to eat that day. Well, as it turned out, of course, the monk whose duty it was that day to bring the food to the gate was that old monk. And he was just torn. You know, this is something that he had prayed for years and years, but he knew that if he didn't show up, there were going to be people that were going to go hungry that day because he stayed in his room with this vision. So he was torn between the duty he knew he had and the sort of the ecstatic, mystical experience he was in the midst of. But just before the bell stopped ringing, he knew in his heart what he had to do, so he sort of tore himself away. He got up, he turned his back on that vision that he had prayed for most of his life, closed his door, went out, and brought food to the people in need. He served those who needed help. With everything that needed to be done, bringing the food to the gate, cleaning up afterwards, talking a little bit with the folks, it was over an hour before he got back to his room. And when he opened his cell door, he was amazed again because the vision was still there. It hadn't left. And in fact, now a voice came from the vision and said to him, "My son, had you not gone off to feed the poor, I would not have stayed." So even though that man had spent his whole life in a religious order, living in a monastery, praying every day, going to Mass every day, it took that long for him to learn that greatest spiritual lesson. He learned the greatest lesson in his life that day. Now, he had already given up everything when he came into the monastery. He gave up family, he gave up the chance of children, he gave up material wealth. But that day he learned that the best way to serve God isn't necessarily to divest yourself of everything, to give up everything, to turn your back on the world, and to spend your life praying for or contemplating this mystical vision. He found out that the best way to serve God is much more basic than that. The best way to serve God is to do what Christ urges the disciples in the gospel, to reach out in service to our sisters and brothers, especially those who are in great need. What are Jesus' words to them? If anyone wishes to be first, he shall be the last of all and the servant of all. I think maybe we think of servants as butlers, maids, someone dressed in black and white who's going to bring us something, but that's one kind of servant. That's not what Jesus is talking about. I learned about service in a peculiar way. Well, I think it was a peculiar way. I grew up in Caribou, Maine. My father owned a local business. He owned a men's clothing store, so we sold clothes to everybody in the area. That's where I learned about service, in the context of customer service, in the context of, it was an economic context, but it was still important. It wasn't like working out in the mall in the middle of a big urban area. We're talking Caribou, Maine here. There's a limited number of people. You were going to meet most of them because they were going to come in and they needed to buy pants and suits and sweaters and underwear and socks. And you learn to not only serve them, but, you know, my father's philosophy always was the customer comes first, because that's that's where our wherewithal comes from, out of those people's pockets. Because if we treat them well enough, they're going to come back. And you guys know, in a small town, that's important. You know your customers, because they're also your neighbors. They're your family, they're your friends. So while it wasn't an economic context, I really took that to heart, and that was part of my philosophy in whatever job I was in. I always worked in a job that had service, some service to do with it. Now that doesn't mean that I was serving the poor or working in a soup kitchen, but I was serving those around me. When I worked at a video store, I was helping people enjoy their leisure time more. You know, giving my time to them. I have, my pet peeve is customer service, and I have a pretty high standard for it when I go into a place. But, you know, I didn't just say, oh, what do you want for a movie? You know, we talk. What do you like? What do you, because it was important to me that they left happy. So what does that have to do with the gospel? Well, the gospel, I think, is an invitation to us and a challenge to us, just as it was to the disciples. You know, they were all wrapped up in who's going to be first, who's going to have that first seat, that first chair. They weren't seeing, even though they were walking with him every day, they weren't seeing that's not important to Jesus. But this gospel invites us to ask ourselves, what is our spirit of service in the work that we do right now? And like I said, it doesn't have to be volunteer work or work directly with the poor or those in need. Whatever job we have, wherever we work, in the home, out in the world, whether we're a parent raising kids, I don't think any hands would come up if I tried to get you to say that that wasn't a form of service to the community and to the family. Whether you work in an office, whether you work in a factory, whether you work in a field, whether you work in customer service like I do. There needs to be a spirit of service in whatever we do. So that's the invitation. You know, what kind of spirit of service do I have in the job that I do? Then there's the challenge. So when you ask yourself that, maybe, you know, the patrons don't play till tonight, so maybe take some time this afternoon. Then think about it over the week. And the challenge would be, then ask yourself, whatever my level of service is in what I do now, whether I'm retired, whether I'm working full-time, whether I volunteer, how can I bring to my work a greater spirit of service than I have now? It's worth asking, I think. Because, again, this is what our God calls us to. That's what the letter of St. James is telling us. Because when you're concentrating on how do I serve others, then there isn't jealousy. There isn't selfish ambition. Hopefully there isn't disorder in every foul practice. Wisdom from above. What does he say it is? It's pure, it's peaceable, it's gentle, it's compliant. No inconstancy or insincerity. Do we serve people sincerely? I just want to finish with the words of a gentleman named Dr. Albert Schweitzer. I'm sure that name's familiar to some folks out there, maybe not the younger folks, but a musician who sort of turned his back on the concert halls of Europe. He had a chance to be a very famous man in the eyes of the world. He said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be a missionary doctor to the poor in Africa. And he turned out to be a famous man for a much different reason. These are his words. He said, I don't know what your destiny will be, but one thing I know. The only ones among you who will really be happy are those who sought and found how to serve.